Değerli konuklarımız, iyi akşamlar. Online kitap tanıtım etkinliğimize hoş geldiniz. Dear participants, good evening and welcome to our book launch. At the beginning of our program, let me remind you that our event will be bilingual, both in Turkish and English. If you could activate the subtitle icon at the Zoom, you can have a simultaneous translation from Turkish to English or from English to Turkish. Let me now switch to Turkish for a short introduction, and then we will continue in English in the first section of our book launch. Göç Araştırmaları Vakfı olarak bu akşam dünyanın en önemli göç uzmanlarından Profesör Hein de Haas'ı konuk edeceğimiz için gerçekten çok mutluyuz ve heyecanlıyız. GAV Perspektif Yayınları, Hein de Haas'ın göç çalışmalarında çığır açan 2023 yılında Penguin Yayınevi tarafından yayınlanmış olan How Migration Works kitabının Türkçesini geçtiğimiz Mart ayında yayınladı. Bu önemli eseri Türkçeye kazandırdığımız için GAV Perspektif Yayınevi olarak gerçekten de çok mutluyuz. Devam etmeden önce program akışı ile ilgili bir duyuru yapmak isterim. Etkinliğimiz 2 bölümden oluşacak. İlk kısım İngilizce olacak. Bu kısımda Sayın Profesör de Haas sunumunu İngilizce olarak yapacak ve bizlere kitabının bir analizini sunacak. Onun ardından İngilizce soru cevap bölümü yapacağız. Bu bölümde sadece İngilizce soruları kabul edebiliyoruz. Chat'ten yazabilirsiniz ya da parmak kaldırabilirsiniz, sizlere söz verebiliriz. Bunun ardından ikinci kısmımızda Türkçe olarak gerçekleştireceğiz etkinliğimizi. İngilizceden Türkçe'ye çeviri için Zoom'un bir özelliği bulunuyor değerli katılımcılar. Eğer sağda altta 3 noktalı olan kısımda altyazı etkinliğini etkinleştirebilirseniz, dilerseniz Türkçe olan kısımda, İngilizce olan kısımda Türkçe çeviriyi doğrudan doğruya Zoom üzerinden görebilmeniz mümkün olacak. Detaylı bilgi arkadaşlarım chatten de size iletecekler. Şimdi izninizle İngilizceye geçiyorum ve programın ilk bölümünü başlatıyorum. Dear participants, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to our online book launch this evening. We are truly honored to host a very distinguished academic and leading expert on migration, Professor Hein de Haas. We sincerely thank him for joining us and generously sharing his time with us this evening. It is a great privilege to have him at this event. This webinar marks the launch of the Turkish translation of How Migration Really Works, authored by Professor de Haas and published by GAV Perspektif Publishing House. GAV Perspektif is the publishing house of the Migration Research Foundation based in Ankara. Founded in 2019, GAV Perspektif has already published 36 books, focusing on migration and diaspora issues. We are also proud to have published the Turkish edition of The Age of Migration, International Population Movements in the Modern World, back in 2022, in which Professor de Haas is the lead author. Turning to focus of today's event, How Migration Really Works, this important book challenges 22 common myths about migration and offers a substantial contribution to the field by questioning widely held misconceptions, prejudices, and myths. Migration is a subject, as you all know, that evokes strong emotions. For some, those emotions are hopeful and positive, but for others, they are marked by fear or uncertainty. It is also a topic that often polarizes public opinion. Many people believe that we are experiencing the highest levels of migration in history, or that governments have lost control over their borders. Others, on the other hand, argue that migrants are necessary to counter the effects of aging populations, mainly in the developed countries. Professor de Haas tackles these assumptions with a scientific, evidence-based approach that cuts through these prejudices and brings much-needed clarity to the conversation. Before we invite him for his speech and for his review, allow me to briefly introduce Professor de Haas. Although I must say it is a challenge to summarize such an extensive academic career in just a few moments, but I have to. Professor Hein de Haas is a professor of sociology at the University of Amsterdam. From 2006 to 2015, he co-founded and co-directed the International Migration Institute at the University of Oxford. He now continues to direct this institute from the Netherlands. He also holds the position of Professor of Migration and Development at Maastricht University. And in 2004-2005, he was a visiting scholar at Bilkent University here in Ankara. His research centers mainly on the long-term trends, causes, and impacts of international migration in both origin and destination societies. His most recent book, How Migration Really Works, was published by Penguin in 2023. And just in 2 years, it has already been translated into different languages, including German, Dutch, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Greek, Korean, and now to Turkish as well. Without further ado, I am delighted to give the floor to Professor Hein de Haas. Professor, the floor is yours.
Many thanks for this wonderful introduction, very humbling. Can you hear me? Okay, thanks for showing up in such great numbers. I really feel honored and I'm really looking forward to this evening. If possible, I would appreciate if you can turn your cameras on. For some of you, it may not be practical, not be possible, but it gives me more of a feeling of being in a group than looking at black screens. I understand if you're not there can be reasons why you can't turn it on, so I don't want to sound too directive, but it just makes for a bit more cozier experience in a flat screened world. So thanks for that. I will try not to talk for too long because particularly with webinars, I have the experience. It's always good to not have an extremely long monologue and have enough time for question and answers, so to make it more interactive. So I will try to keep it to 20 minutes as I was instructed, so we have a bit more time for, or to 15 minutes, so we have a bit more time for discussion and question and answer. Well, thanks again. Let me perhaps first tell you why I wrote the book. As many of you have been working on migration for many years, or actually since I started as a student studying migration. It's been 30 years now I've been studying migration, but over the course of my career, I became increasingly frustrated by the fact that so little of what we know is actually reaching the public debate. So that's why I wrote the book, and this book is not addressing a scientific audience, but primarily a general audience of interested readers, whether journalists, average citizens interested in the topic, but could also be students, obviously, but it was not, my prime target was not researchers. And I tried to write a book in a very accessible way, so I avoided any form of unnecessary jargon, and that for me was a huge conversion away from the sort of way social scientists tend to write. But I also think it's something we should be doing more and more as researchers in order to reach broader publics. So although I've written the book, tried to write the book in an extremely accessible way, so that it is easy to understand for anybody, including non-researchers. The book is deeply theoretical. I mean, at the surface you think the book is tackling 22 myths, but what I in a way try to do is to outline a new paradigm for understanding migration, a new theory basically. Because the theories we tend to use to understand migration are totally inadequate and actually very misleading in many ways. I, for instance, refer to the so-called push-pull model, which in my view is a quasi-theory, which actually puts us on the wrong footing in terms of understanding the nature and causes of international migration. But that model, either consciously or subconsciously, has remained incredibly dominant, both in academic and popular and policy sort of understandings of migration. And it also tries to address a different bias. I think by and large you could say that migration literature is predominantly focused on the consequences of migration for countries of destination. Whether in Europe, whether in North America and other parts of the world, it's primarily been about us. What does migration mean to us? I guess nowadays in Turkey, there's a lot of debates as well on what migration means to Turkey, for instance, of Syrian refugees and other more recent migrants that have increasingly settled in Turkey. So this is what we call the receiving country bias. And that's a huge problem, because how can we actually understand migration if we only see half of the picture? So whereas the debate is totally fixated on people coming, integration, issues of racism, and all of these are important topics, we tend to forget about the other side of migration, countries of origin, processes of migration seen from the other side. And as the famous Algerian sociologist Abdelmalek Sayed had already argued back in the 1970s, every immigrant is also an emigrant, but the latter perspective is generally being ignored. So that's a huge scientific gap. So implicitly, the book tries to address this much bigger gap, although in its form, it doesn't sound very theoretical. What I'm trying to do is make a plea for a different vision of migration, not as a problem to be solved, nor as a solution to problems. So we have the positive and sort of the negative views, but as it is. And the new paradigm I'm trying to advocate in the book is a paradigm that goes back to the sort of Oxford School of Migration Studies, which we established with the International Migration Institute 15 years ago, is to try to look at migration as an intrinsic part of much bigger processes of development and social transformation, instead of this problem to be fixed or this solution to problems, because the latter perspectives are highly ideological views that have little to do with achieving a more fundamental understanding of international migration. And this is important because a lot of policy failure can also be attributed to a lack of understanding of migration. So as long as we don't have a real understanding of how migration really works, hence the title of the book, policies will keep on failing. Because that is, of course, the real question. We do research also, I think, still to contribute to a better world. But what we see is that policymakers, governments have kept on making the same fundamental errors in terms of policy design. I cannot do a review of migration policies in this relatively short time, but it is clear that recycling the same policies that haven't worked in the past won't solve real migration problems. They generally tend to make them worse. So we need this new paradigm also to develop better policies. And I try to do that in the book by tackling 22 different myths. And those myths are not exclusively right or left-wing myths. Some of them are more prevalent in left-wing, or are more prevalent in right-wing, so conservative versus progressive circles. But some of those myths are pretty widely shared across the board. And I try to use and dismantle those myths and question them to show this need for a totally different way of viewing migration. So the myths are more like an entry into showing that we need a very different understanding of migration. Now, of course, in this short presentation, I cannot address all of the myths, but I will just select 4 of them and discuss them very briefly to show sort of my method of the book, and also to show the need for this very different view. Now, the first myth, which I think is most widely shared myth about migration amongst academics, but also amongst politicians from the left to the right, that we live in times of unprecedented mass migration, that migration in a way is running out of hand. The explanations we can hear are different, are various. It's often linked to issues of poverty, inequality, conflict, climate change, and this idea that all of these factors are pushing more and more people to migrate. The term push is already evident here. And in addition, we often think that communication and transport infrastructure, globalization, has made it so much easier for people to move around the world. So it sounds very logical that migration is accelerating fast and spinning out of control. And this is also evident in political discourse and media images of migrants trying to cross the Mediterranean, or if we cross the Atlantic, the so-called caravans trying to cross Mexico into the United States. So it adds to this image of migration getting out of control. Well, if you look at the political spectrum on the left and the right, politicians may and experts may provide different so-called solutions. On the right, you may hear more often, we need to crack down on borders even more, we need even more restrictive immigration policies. On the left-wing progressive side, you will hear more often solutions, quote unquote, like we need to provide aid and we need to stimulate development, we need to prevent conflict so as to reduce migration. But what I find quite striking in my background research is that fundamental assumption that migration is spinning out of control is quite widely shared across the board, including in most academic circles. So although the political framing of it may be very different, the underlying implicit analysis of this migration spinning out of control as a result of inequality and poverty and conflict and even climate change is quite widely shared. The problem is, once we look at the data, we have to question this. Of course, the total number of migrants is higher than ever, but so is the world population. So if we really want to understand whether migration has been accelerating, we'd of course also have to look at relative figures. And there is no real evidence, if we look at the data in the longer term, that migration is necessarily much higher than it was half a century or a century ago. We have even reasons to believe it was actually higher in relative terms a century ago. Migrants represent, depending on what statistics you use, between 3 and 3.5% of the total world population. I mean international migrants, people living outside their country of origin. So on the longer term, we see a remarkable stability. That also goes for refugee migration. Well, refugee migration is a very erratic form of migration, much more erratic than, let's say, normal forms of migration, like labor migration and family migration. It goes with very high peaks and very deep valleys. So, of course, what we've seen with the civil war in Syria and the conflict of Ukraine, we see clear peaks of refugee migration. But once again, when we look at the longer term, there is not a global acceleration of refugee migration if we look at several decades. We see ups and downs over many years, and there are good reasons to believe that in the early 50s, even in absolute terms, numbers were higher than they're right now. Of course, wherever migrants and refugees concentrate, things look very different, but I'm talking about the global level here. So it doesn't deny that migration can provide challenges at particular points in particular countries where a lot of refugees and migrants concentrate, but the idea that on a global level the phenomenon is running out of hand is simply incorrect. The same goes for this idea that we are talking more and more about undocumented or illegal migration. For instance, one of the statistics I use in my book is an estimate I made myself from a European perspective. For instance, the image is often, when we talk about African migration, this is primarily about illegal border crossings. But roughly 9 out of 10 Africans who move to Europe moves actually legally with passports and paper in hand. And of course, these 90% doesn't catch the statistics and the media images. What we see in the media are, of course, the sad cases where people may die and suffer at the borders, but this is not representative for the overall picture. So we see clear changes in migration, and I'll get back to that briefly, but this idea of a massive exodus or an invasion is simply not correct. That doesn't mean, however, that nothing changed in international migration. But the main change in global migration over the last half a century is not so much about numbers, it's about the dominant direction of migration flows. And this is particularly true from a West European perspective. Because, of course, Western Europe has been, for many centuries, a continent of outmigration. And we talk about ever the days of the so-called discoveries of the Americas. Western Europe has been an emitter of migrants, of colonists, of settlers, of soldiers, of missionaries, and later of ordinary migrants, predominantly to the Americas, but in more recent times also to Asia and Africa. Now, those patterns have been fundamentally reversed after the Second World War. First, starting in Northwestern Europe, Europe has transformed from a continent of outmigration to a continent of in-migration. And the number of countries that have been added to these immigration countries has progressively been expanding to include Southern European countries, but now even Turkey is also entering this phase of becoming an immigration country more and more. So we see a growing number of countries in Greater Europe, if I can call it like that, that have become destination countries. And Europeans have stopped migrating in big numbers, as in the past, to the Americas and other continents. That had fundamental consequences also for migration to the Americas, because migration to America used to be European migration. migration to the Americas has progressively become Latin American and, of course, Asian and to some extent African in nature. So it is the disappearance of Europeans progressively on the international migration stage, particularly Western Europeans, and the fundamental shifting role of Europe in a global migration map that is a major change. Of course, there are different changes as well. Very important one to mention is the rise of the Gulf region as another major migration destination in the world. So we see major shifts in the dominant direction of migration. But this is, of course, understandable that from a Western European perspective, and I think more recently also from a Turkish perspective, things are changing rapidly because countries that used to see themselves as emigration countries suddenly experience the phenomenon of becoming a destination country. But of course, historically speaking, we're not necessarily talking about a more massive phenomenon. We have actually good reasons to believe that during the times of massive European migrations to the Americas, global migration rates in terms of percentages were actually way higher than they're right now. Well, the second myth is this idea that border restrictions reduce migration. Many people are surprised when I say this, or they misinterpret what I'm trying to say as a plea for open borders. The only evidence I'm citing in my book, and that evidence comes both from Europe and North America, is that if we really want to develop a scientific understanding of how border restrictions, immigration restrictions, influence migration, we again have to get rid of this one-sided focus on immigration. Because a scientific view on migration understands migration as a process of coming and going. Migration isn't a static move from A to B, it is a highly circular process. And if migration is free, as is the case for migration within countries or within regional blocs like the European Union, migration tends to be highly circular. That means that migrants generally move to seek opportunities like work, joining family, or studying. But many migrants tend to return once that opportunity disappears, once people have achieved their degrees. Some people may stay, but the flux is very high in terms of people coming in and people going back. So if we really want to understand what a border restriction, like the introduction of a visa or more stringent border controls, does to migration, we shouldn't only look at people coming in. We should look at how border restrictions affect the overall process of circulation, coming and going of migrants. And there we have very strong evidence that shows that the more difficult you make it to come, the less migrants tend to go back. Which means that the effect of border restrictions on net migration, so the number of people that will eventually stay, which is the preoccupation of governments, of course, is highly ambiguous. And we actually have evidence that in many cases, the paradoxical effect may be positive. And the classic cases are the Mexican workers to the US, which used to be a free flow of people to the US coming back and forth, and increasing border enforcement, which is not a new phenomenon, which is not invented by Donald Trump, since the 1980s and 90s, have turned a largely circular flow of Mexicans to the United States in a permanently settled population of more than 10 million people. Roughly the same happened with the so-called guest workers from countries like Turkey and North Africa, who moved to Western Europe in the 1960s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. When more border restrictions were introduced, lots of workers actually decided to stay, and subsequently to bring their families over, creating this huge migration multiplier. And governments actually ended up with more migrants settling than probably would have been the case without those more stringent border restrictions. I can give you many more examples of highly paradoxical effects of immigration restrictions, but I'm running out of time, so I won't go further. But it shows that an ill-conceived border restriction that does not take into account the process, how it will affect the overall process of circulation, often explains that immigration, perhaps well-intended immigration policies, but ill-conceived immigration policies, can have counterproductive effects. That doesn't mean we have to abolish immigration policies or abolish border controls necessarily, but it means that it is complex. And that it is very difficult for governments to combine two things. On the one hand, to want to control immigration and to limit immigration, and on the other hand, to stimulate return migration. It is very difficult to reconcile both objectives. And it shows that immigration policy is as complex a policy as any other policy, like economic policies, for instance. That's why we need a scientific view on migration, a much more nuanced view on migration, to understand why policies have kept on, in a way, failing us in terms of not being effective and often having counterproductive effects. Once again, I don't have time to go fully into detail how we should then deal with migration, but it shows that the current frame and the current one-sided understanding and very biased view of migration is not scientific. Now, what about this other idea? This is myth number 3. You often hear it on the more, I would say, progressive and left-wing side and development agency will say, yes, indeed, governments have struggled to contain immigration. The only solution is to bring development to poor countries. And it sounds very sympathetic. It sounds very logical. You have to take away the so-called root causes of migration. The Biden government has used that terminology. Many European policies use that idea, often coupled to deals with origin countries providing help so as to take away the needs for people to migrate. However, this is based on an extremely simplistic understanding of migration, the push-pull model, to which I already alluded to, which by and large frames migration, particularly from poor countries, as a desperate flight from misery. It represents migrants predominantly as economic refugees who are fleeing oppression, poverty, and in other cases, violence. It often reduces them to victims of smugglers and traffickers selling false images of El Dorado and the destination. And of course, there are migrants who are really fleeing horrible situations. And the case of refugee migration from Syria is an obvious case. But it's a one-sided perspective. It is not representative for the overall picture of migration. It also discounts agency that even refugees have in terms of deciding how and where to migrate. In general, research shows that migration is an investment in a better future that creates better opportunities. But the whole assumption that poverty and inequality drives migration is actually quite flawed. Not only because migration is an investment, and most migrants make those decisions quite consciously, but also because migration is expensive. And migration, as I argued in a different paper, requires a lot of aspirations and capabilities. So it's a resource, migration, rather than a desperate flight. The irony is the poorest of the poorest generally cannot migrate, certainly not over long distances. So it shouldn't surprise us, and I think the Turkish case is an excellent example, but so is the Mexican case. The big emigration countries of the last half a century were anything but the poorest countries in the world. And if we look more generally at the evidence, both historically and contemporary evidence, most migration worldwide is dominated by middle-income countries. And that is not a coincidence, because when countries transition from low to middle income, we see a general reduction of poverty levels and increasing access to education and information increases people's capabilities and aspirations to migrate. So we get this non-linear pattern where emigration, both within countries and from countries, actually accelerates with development. So rural, urban migration, migration abroad, only when countries tend to enter this high income bracket, of course, they start to transition from being an emigration to a net immigration country. And presumably Turkey is in the middle of that process from that perspective. But what it shows, we have to completely turn around this idea of the poverty push. Actually, the biggest victims of whether it's violence or extreme impoverishment, or if you like climate change, are those people who cannot flee at all. And it also forces us to rethink migration, not so much as this desperate flight from misery, but primarily a way of individuals to create a better future for themselves and their families. So migration won't solve the migration problem. And that is also the deeper flawed assumption behind this whole thinking. Also in many academic circles, migration is often seen as the antithesis of development. And here I quote my mentor, Ronald Skeldon, who's written this beautiful book back in the 1990s on migration and development. And his very last, he taught me a lot of these things. His very last sentence in his book is, migration is development. So whatever way we define development as, increasing income, decreasing poverty, better access to information, improved living conditions. Initially, the pattern is more migration, more people moving. And the higher skilled are, it's not coincidental that the higher skilled are dominant amongst global migrants. So in a way, we have to reverse the perspective. And certainly we have to fundamentally challenge the classic push-pull theory. So neither border controls nor development will solve the issue. And I think in a way it shows the broader problem. It's the framing of migration predominantly as a problem to be solved. We, of course, all know, I guess, sitting here around the table, that migration is as old as mankind, humankind, and that migration is an intrinsic part of who we've always been as societies. We've always moved. That doesn't mean that migration is always something good or bad. It just means that we have to normalize our understanding of migration. And that makes me come back to this fundamental understanding of migration as an intrinsic and therefore inevitable part of much bigger processes of development and social transformation. And I think the key example is not even about international migration. It's about this massive transfer of population from rural to urban areas. Almost all governments around the world have tried to stop the so-called rural exodus, rural to urban migration. All governments have failed to do so. Because economic modernization inevitably means a transfer of economic activities from rural to urban sectors. And you don't have to like urbanization, you don't have to like urban overcrowding to understand that this is an inevitable part of the process. It does not mean that governments cannot mitigate or cannot do anything, of course, to try to influence both internal and international migration. But if the presumption is you're going to reverse the process, you're going to stop the process, any policy will be bound to fail because it's simply not based on a real understanding of the true nature and fundamental causes of migration. So as long as we keep on trying to think away migration, we're buying into a whole set of illusions. And this also leads to delusion politics that have often driven international migration. Well, it brings me to the very last myth, and I don't have to talk about it for too long. And this is about, some people may ask, what are then the true causes of migration? Now, one answer is development. But if we now switch the perspective from the origin country to the destination country, I think another very prevalent myth is this idea that migrants take away jobs. And this idea, it's very popular amongst the populist politicians to frame migrants as people who either take away jobs or drive down labor standards, and they become framed as this economic threat. Now, if we look at the evidence from the economics literature, it's quite clear that we have to reverse the fundamental causality of the whole argument. Migrants are not so much taking away jobs, migrants fill vacancies. And this is shown by the extraordinarily high correlation between economic growth in destination countries and levels of immigration. With the exception, of course, of refugee immigration, if you look at any other form of immigration, it's the business cycle that largely drives immigration. And even for immigration shocks like created by refugees, and I think Turkey experienced such a huge hike of immigration, I actually cite evidence in the book from Turkey that shows that locally and regional economies adapt very fast to the new labor supply simply by increasing the overall size of the economy. And it's very difficult to find these, to substantiate these claims about migrants driving down wages. It is certainly true that higher income earners benefit way more from immigration than lower income earners, but the overall argument that migration drives down wages, leads to unemployment, actually is not substantiated by evidence. We rather have to reverse the whole main causality of the argument. And it exposes something, which is the political hypocrisy that surrounds migration from a destination country perspective. Because on the one hand, we have politicians saying we have to crack down on illegal migration, we have to reduce legal migration of lower skilled workers, but at the same time, in practice, we see a huge gap, which we call the discursive gap, between the tough language and the largely symbolic border crackdowns and the reality in which politicians, and I would say societies at large, tolerate situations in which migrant workers, whether with or without papers, are massively exploited on labor markets because it's a very convenient source of labor. And that, I think, goes for all destination countries, including Turkey, as far as I know the evidence. So there's this huge gap, and it is very clear in very low levels of labor enforcement. Just one statistic to highlight this issue is that the number of employers in the United States that got criminally prosecuted for employing undocumented migrants on a yearly basis is roughly between 15 and 20 without any zeros added per year, which is roughly the chance of being hit by lightning. And I'm collecting a whole bunch of evidence from a whole series of other countries, and including in Europe, it is roughly the same picture. Everybody knows that migrants fill in those essential functions, the so-called essential lower skilled jobs. And they're increasingly doing so in both middle and higher income countries where local native workers often no longer are willing or able to do those jobs. So I just wanted to emphasize sort of the political scene and coming back to, and in a way, this last point also stresses or emphasizes that we need to see migration as an intrinsic part of these much bigger processes of transformation. So if we have society moving into a higher middle income or higher income bracket, those countries are inevitably becoming immigration countries. And of course, that is the conundrum in which many European countries have found themselves in the past. I mean, back in the 1980s, 1990s, you could still hear many German politicians saying, Germany is not an immigration country. And I think you can now hear the same narratives in new immigration countries around the world. So this state of denial is very high. And again, it shows the inability, in a way, to understand the inevitability of migration as a part of a much bigger process, not just of economic development, but also of social transformation. Well, let me stop here. I've talked for enough. Actually, I filled 25 minutes, I guess, although I tried to be shorter. And I just gave this example to highlight that we need this fundamentally different perspective on migration. For the rest you can find in my book, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions. Thanks a lot.
Professor, thank you very much for this very thought-provoking analysis and review of your book. I just would like to highlight several concepts that you have emphasized. One is receiving country bias. I think that is quite important, and that is a common mistake, I would say. And migration is an intrinsic part of transformation processes, and state of denial, that is also very common all over the world. And you have highlighted 4 myths in the book. There are 22 myths in total. And, in order to be able to understand the main dynamics and an analysis based on data, I think your book is a wonderful reference book for all of us and for all researchers, but as you mentioned, for all those people who are interested in migration, who want to learn more about the migration processes. And now the floor is open for your questions and comments. And you can write in the chat box, or you can raise your hand and we can open. Atakan Hocam has a question. I am going to read it. Thank you for your presentation. Dr. Atakan Durmaz is asking a question. What are your thoughts on the impact of diasporas in this process? Do you think whether diasporas are in a position to influence the processes that you mentioned?
It's a very good question. I think the diasporas have an important part to play, particularly influencing governments of destination countries that tend to run behind the facts. But I would also say in countries of origin. I mean, a country I know much better than Turkey is Morocco, because most of my research has been about Morocco. And also Morocco is, for instance, seeing more and more migration from West African countries and people settling there. And the irony somewhere, and some diaspora organizations have critiqued also the government, is saying, while you critique European governments of not treating Moroccan migrants well, but actually you are treating migrants on your own soil as bad as European migrants are being treated. Our migrants are being treated in Europe. So I think the diasporas could play an important role, I think, of holding a mirror in the face of governments and providing a proactive place in the debate, both in destination and origin countries, by providing this critical perspective. Like, let's not forget we are, or we were, or we are still immigrants ourselves. And let's also not make the same errors. I think what we right now see is a lot of copycatting of European, Western Europe, EU type of border policies in many middle-income countries, which will have the same unfortunate effects as they had in the past in Western Europe. So I definitely think the diasporas have an important part to play there.
Thank you so much. And Başak Kale from Middle East Technical University. Başak Hocam.
Yes, great. Thank you for organizing this amazing, I think, talk, Birgül Hocam and Zafer Hocam. Professor Haas, like, obviously, they are putting your book as one of the main reads, and now seeing the second book out as well, as also in Turkish, is also pretty amazing. Listening these four different myths. Right now, I'm residing in UK, in London. I'm myself an Oxford graduate, and now seeing the Labour government's white paper out, as you probably know, yesterday, has created a huge debate in the UK trying to tackle the migration problem, as it's been mentioned, is just basically covering all the points that you have raised. So maybe asking the question on the fourth myth, maybe you can elaborate a bit better in that regard. Like, taking, for example, the UK as an example, obviously there's a huge shortage of skilled and unskilled migrants in the UK, like care workers, for example, but the current Labour government's willingness to reduce migration, it sounds like it's quite controversial, and as you have mentioned, it's basically filling the vacancies. Like, there is a need from hairdressers to medical doctors, but acting on this way, first of all, do you think that this will create other kind of repercussions in the other countries like Europe, because we sometimes see this kind of butterfly effect, or we will see that this is just only a reaction after the elections, and they will just come down and have a more sensible kind of and more research data-based policy being developed? What is your sense on that? Thank you.
In having lived for 10 years in the UK, I mean, like in any European country, perhaps more than anywhere else in Europe, politicians are extremely afraid in the UK to tell the real story about migration, which probably all politicians know, and it goes both for Labour and Conservatives, which is and same goes for my own country, the Netherlands, that the debate is so much focused on the boats and refugees that it totally can't affect the large majority of migrants. At least 90% is not coming to flee conflicts, actually either to fill in jobs or join family members. And that shows the fear to address the real elephant in the room, which is this labor demand issue. Now, if you would ask me, what can you do about migration if you really want to do so as a government, and several politicians have asked me to do so, and I don't think it's a legitimate standpoint as such if you say, I want less immigration. If you're really serious about that as a government in the longer term, you'd have to re-regulate your labor market. You have to neoliberalize your economy. You have the governments to interfere much more in labor hiring processes. Well, the political trend in terms of economic policies over the last 3 to 4 decades, ever the Thatcher governments, both Labour and Conservative, has exactly been the opposite direction. So I think the UK and the US are prime examples of countries that have totally liberalized their labor markets, and therewith also the ability of governments to control what's happening. And the big dislike of big, broader government intervention already shows that governments don't want to interfere in those labor markets. And the enforcement levels in the UK are as low as they're in the US. I cited that statistic. It's actually laughable. And this, again, shows this political hypocrisy and the fact that politicians are, in a way, too afraid to deal with the real issue because they're so afraid to be seen as soft in immigration. And here I cite my colleague from the US, Douglas Massey, who said in his big reviews of US immigration policy that he came to the conclusion that the prime objective is to create an impression of being in control. And if you succeed in doing that, it's all going to be fine. And there's barely any debate on the effectiveness of immigration policies. I mean, the biggest irony was that one big argument in favor of Brexit was to get more immigration control. And the analysis seemed logical because it was true that the only way to stop free inflows from Eastern European workers into the UK was to get out of the European Union. But after Brexit, immigration tripled to the United Kingdom for several reasons, but the main reason being that the labor crunch wasn't resolved and migrants were coming from farther away and were less inclined to go back for all these reasons I was already mentioned. So the policy was completely counterproductive. But politicians don't want the public to see and understand this, and they want a real debate because you cannot have both at the same time. On the one hand, you want this neoliberal, free, laissez-faire economy, and on the other hand, you want less migrants coming. You cannot have your cake and eat it both. But governments want to have it both, and it creates very powerful incentives to create an impression of being in control. Just want to mention that Trump has very successfully engineered this image of being tough on immigration. Well, Trump did not build that wall, only tiny sections, and legal immigration reached an all-time high under the previous Trump government. Just two statistics to make you think about this.
Now, Ali Zafer Sağroğlu from Yıldırım Beyazıt University has a question. Ali Zafer Hocam.
Thank you very much, Birgül Hocam, and appreciated Professor Hein de Haas. We are really happy to see you in this evening, in this event. Thank you very much. When I saw the title of your book, actually, I thought that, yes, another publication of Hein de Haas to challenge the common prejudice about the migration or human mobilities, let's say. But you are also challenging anti-prejudice arguments as well. I mean, time to time, you say that, yeah, I mean, well balanced between the prejudice and the realities, and this is the point. Really, I appreciate it. My question is about when I read your book. Mainly, I thought that all these arguments centered with the European or welfare societies. Actually, Turkey, like a Turkey, the developing country and middle income countries. I would like to learn from you what are the differences or similarities, for example, Turkey, regarding your arguments in your books, and how do you see the Turkey from your side, how it seems? Because in the last 2 decades, Turkey has faces very dramatic changes in his migration characteristics. Not I'm talking about the Syrian influxes, but before the Syrians, Turkey had already become a net migration country. And in the last decade, Turkey, besides the other specialties, Turkey is also become the top of the origin countries of asylum seekers in Europe, for example, interestingly. How do you see Turkey position regarding from your expertise? Thank you.
Apart from the refugee perspective, which, like I said, refugee migration follows quite different dynamics compared to any other form of migration. But if you look at long-term general migration trends, Turkey seems to fit in the perspective that was originally developed by Wilbur Zelinsky back in 1971, and those sort of frames have been picked up by Ronald Skeldon, and I try to further elaborate them, which we refer to as transition theory, migration or mobility transition theory. And it's exactly along these lines that tends to show that if countries sort of go through this modern transformation, if I can call it like that, of industrialization, growing education, better infrastructure, demographic change, this whole and complex of cultural change as well. This whole complex of change, which I prefer to call social transformation, because development tend to be so limited to only the economic dimension, tends to accelerate mobility both within but also from countries, and that sort of can explain this paradox of accelerating migration. But then beyond some point, and well, beyond some mid-level income point, and Turkey is clearly beyond that point. The same goes for a country like Mexico. I think Turkey and Mexico are quite comparable in that sense. They're clearly, I mean, from this perspective, Turkey and Mexico are clearly in this transition phase where they are transforming from a net emigration into a net, not emigration to a net immigration country. Of course, from year to year, you may see fluctuations. The longer term trend clearly, like you were saying, already way before the civil war in Syria, the western part of Turkey in particular was already attracting more and more migrants from both the Middle East, Central Asia, but also even African countries. And that totally fits the theory. And some early developments of that transition you may see in some North African countries, like including Morocco, although it's in a kind of a different phase. So from that perspective, it's almost inevitable that a country like Turkey will attract more and more migrants in the future. Of course, the big unpredictable factor is always politics. Some big political event that may, of course, reverse those processes. And it's also the danger of these theories to be absolutely sure about how these things evolve, you won't know, but providing political stability in the future, it's almost inevitable, if you look at particularly demographic economic trends, that Turkey will keep on attracting migrants in the future. But I think this also makes us rethink global migration. What about China? China is already facing huge labor challenges. What if China at some point will adopt an immigration policy that will change the global migration maps in ways we are very difficult to predict? And this is why I speculate in one of the chapters that perhaps the future question may more and more become, one generation from now, how can we keep people? How can we attract people instead of how should we stop them from coming? Because perhaps the global supply of lower skilled labor will actually run dry in the future. Not in the coming 10 or 15 years, but in the longer term, that may be a realistic scenario. If countries like China are going to attract international migrants, the question will be, where are all these migrants going to come from? If the pool of potential labor suppliers is decreasing in the future, clearly Sub-Saharan Africa is one of the potential major risers in terms of international migration. That's also why I speculate in my book that we've been actually through half a century of Asian migration, where East and Southeast Asian countries have massively entered the global migration stage. And using this set of theory, Sub-Saharan Africa is a very likely candidate to massively enter the global migration stage. Not so much because of poverty, but actually because of development. And that is the big paradox. So this set of theories upsets a lot of commonsensical thinking, primarily because there is no clear linear, it's a very complex and nonlinear relationship between social transformation, development, and migration. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you so much. Professor, if you allow me now, I will collect a few questions and maybe you can have a joint answer for them. First of all, Imran Sarahasan has a question. She states, how do biases in receiving countries shape public perception and policy toward migrants? And what strategies can be implemented to help host societies adapt to and embrace the realities of migration? That is the first question. And second question by Abdullah Onur, that is also quite interesting. What do you think about the role of academia in spreading and perpetuating these myths? Yeah, that is also something quite important. Now, I will have the last two questions. In the second section, we will continue in Turkish. Then you can stay and you can ask your questions because we have some time limitations. Kader Hocam, we are waiting for your question, and then İlayda Hanım, and that will be the last question. As I mentioned, you can stay for the second section as well. And I would be happy if you could keep your questions short. Kader Hocam, please.
Can I answer?
Maybe
Yes.
I can have two more questions, and then maybe you can.
It
How,
is
how do you
difficult.
prefer? How do you prefer?
I prefer to answer those questions first.
Okay,
and,
then.
yeah.
After your
Because
answer, we can get two more questions. Yeah, please.
I try to combine them in a way. I think destination countries' perspective have to adopt. We tend to forget about our own immigration histories as soon as societies turn to be destination countries. I mean, the ultimate example of this is Italy. I mean, Italy was the ultimate emigrator for a century until the 1960s, the biggest provider of migrants worldwide for a very long time. And Italy seems to have forgotten their own immigration history. So, and that is, I think, and that leads me also to the academic bias. I think what Oliver Bakewell, a colleague of mine, when I was working at Oxford, and I wrote quite a lot of things with him, we called it receiving country bias. I think that's the biggest bias, both in the policy perspective and also from the academic perspective, because academics are generally focused on issues of integration, race, identity, economic impacts on destination country, but in a way they forget about understanding the migration process. And there is actually not that much research on understanding the process of migration in its nature and its fundamental causes. And I think that's both a wake-up call for academia to balance more the perspective. So yes, we need research from a destination country perspective, but we need to complement this with this other perspective. So I was citing Abdul Malik Sayed already back in the 1970s, that every immigrant is also an immigrant. We forget about the other half of migration. And yeah, academics, I think, have a lead role to play there to balance those perspectives. And another thing I think is for non-economists to look at economic issues. Because migration is to a significant extent an economic phenomenon. But the economy is part of the social world. And also we as non-economists study immigration, we have to look at issues of labor. Because labor is an important element. It's one of the discoveries I made during my book. I think we cannot afford not to look at those dimensions. And unfortunately, also in migration economics, these issues of the fundamental drivers of migration have been undervalued. Fortunately, we have authors. I was mentioning Zelinsky and Skeldon, and I've tried to contribute myself. And there's, of course, a bigger community of researchers that try to look at process of migration. But I think that is the main thing I would recommend. And that will also be able to inform policies, so we can have more effective policies. And of course, policies that avoid migrants ending in legal limbo zones, being marginalized, being tolerated, but exploited, of course, are recipes for what we tend to call integration failure and segregation.
Thank you so much. And the last two questions, Kader Hanım.
Thank you. I would like to thank you once again for this great presentation and the valuable book you have contributed to the literature of migration. I was particularly struck by your discussion of media, how media plays a central role in shaping public perception of migration. You note that a media narrative opens oversimplify or dramatize migration, contributing to persistent myths. In your opinion, what practical steps can journalists, educators, or researchers take to promote a more balanced and evidence-based narrative about migration? I would really appreciate your insight. Thank you again.
Thank you. Wonderful questions. I think journalists should ask more about the effectiveness of policies, because the debate is very much about the desirability. This party wants to crack down on immigration. We have a government in the Netherlands that has announced they're going to have the most restrictive migration policy ever. But I notice that journalists now assume that the Dutch have the most restrictive immigration policy ever, although no law or regulation has been changed. Case of United States. Trump hasn't deported more people so far than Biden, I think, in his first few months. But it's mediatized to such an extent, it gives this impression of this is more restrictive than ever. Illegal labor is still largely tolerated in America right now, because there's pressure from employers to let this happen. So I think journalists should much more critically ask and scrutinize claims of politicians. Another very popular claim in Europe is that the Turkey deal was successful. Well, I cannot go into details. I mentioned this in my book. I had to stop migration from Syria. although chronologically the argument basically doesn't add up. I can give many more examples where journalists basically don't fact check. They always fact check on other issues where it's about migration, if the efficiency is not being mentioned. For researchers, very briefly, I mentioned this quite extensively in the first part of my book. Researchers have to avoid to frame themselves as pro-migration. I think the biggest problem in the migration debate is this polarization between pro and anti-migration views. And for understandable reasons, migration researchers, of course, want to show the perspective of the weak and the vulnerable, and I have deep sympathy with that. But to turn the argument into a pro-migration argument is very unproductive. Also based on the knowledge that the pro-anti-migration divide cuts across the political perspective. For instance, you can find pro and anti-migration voices both within the left and in the right. And I think it's not the right way to frame the issue. But media very much have the tendency to also frame researchers within the sort of pro-migration camp. And I think their researchers have to always keep a certain critical distance. For instance, by showing that another example I often give when I talk to journalists is that right-wing parties, on average, we have measured this, are not more anti-immigration than left-wing parties. So there's this huge gap between discourse and practice. And I think that is a sort of critical perspective we need to provide. And we need to keep on telling journalists to show, I think the biggest single task both for researchers and journalists is to expose the political hypocrisy on this issue. And a tough language, and on the other hand, the willingness to exploit convenient sources of migrant labor, for instance.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And last question by İlayda Hanım, please.
Hello. Hi, thank you for organizing. I used to be one of Hein's students, so I feel very fortunate to hear him speak about his book. I have a very quick question. Hopefully it's not going to be a repetition of the previous questions. So we've been talking about how migration is not a crisis or it's not a solution as well. And you've mentioned how we should frame it as in terms of development. So how do you think this should shape the practice of policymakers? And also, are there any governments that you currently that you think is implementing policies in line with your evidence-based recommendations?
Yeah. It's great to have a former student here and who is about to start a very exciting PhD trajectory, right? If I can tell the rest of the audience. But anyway, to answer your question, of course, the risk is to provide a very stereotypical image of all policies having failed. I think that will be incorrect. I also highlighted in the last chapter of my book. I think you can actually see progress. I was referring to the fact that it's now unimaginable that the major German politicians would stand up and say, we are not an immigration country. I think most Western European countries have been through this process of coming to terms with the reality of being an immigration country. And certainly when it comes to higher skilled migration, to student migration, and I would even say with regards to family migration, by and large, there has been a learning curve and policies have been improving. Of course, there's still a lot of problems. I think the biggest problem is where it goes to lower skilled labor. There's this huge disjuncture. I mean, Boris Johnson not so long ago said those migrants have no jobs to come to. That was a blatant lie. Everybody living in the UK knows that those migrants are doing all sorts of work, including a lot of undocumented migrants. I think that is where the biggest problem is. And there's barely any politicians who dare, in a way, to tell the truth. That even if in the longer term you want to decrease dependency on this kind of labor through labor market reforms, certainly in the short to medium term, those needs will persist. And if you want to regulate this better, of course you need to create more legal channels, which means that governments actually control it better. That's a big paradox. But politicians tend to see this as political suicide. And this is why they keep on perpetuating those myths of temporality and self-deportation, whereas everybody knows that in practice it doesn't work. So I think there a real challenge is present. You do see differences across countries. What I find interesting that, for instance, in a country like Spain, there's a much more open debate and a much higher willingness to acknowledge the contribution of migrants compared to, for instance, to Italy. where the labor market situation is roughly similar, with a huge dependence in particular sectors on often undocumented migrants. But in the case of Spain, a much bigger political support almost and acknowledgement of this elephant in the room, which is not as big in Spain as it is in many other destination countries. Also in Spain, there's still a lot of problems. I do think you could learn from some countries where there's a slightly bigger flexibility.
Thank you so much for your presentation and for your time. And now we will continue with the second section. I will have a short presentation in Turkish, a short review of Professor de Haas book, and then we will have a discussion in Turkish. Professor, do you have time? Would you like to stay with us?
Yes, I just hope the translation works. There was something in
now,
the
I will change here my language as Turkish, and then I think you can follow the translation. Just a second. Yes, now my language is Turkish. Now I am switching to Turkish as well. Sayın katılımcılar, ben de bu bölümde kısa bir sunum yapacağım kitapla ilgili. Aslında temel amacım Türkçe'de kendi aramızda bir tartışma zemini oluşturabilmek. Tabii yazarın kendisinden sonra konuşmak ve bir kitap tanıtımı yapmak gerçekten de çok zor. Ben kendim kitabı çok severek okudum. Yayınlanmadan önce kitabı okuma şansına sahip oldum ve gerçekten çok etkilendim. Göçle ilgili benim kafamdaki aslında pek çok düşüncenin yani yanlış olduğunu fark ettim. Aslında o mitlerin bir kısmına gerçekten ben de inanıyormuşum. Ama benim kafamdaki pek çok şeyi de sorgulamama yol açtı. Ben de sizlerle kısaca bu düşüncelerimi paylaşmak isterim ve sonra sizlerle tartışmak isterim. Yine profesörün de belirttiği gibi göç, insanlık ortaya çıktığı andan itibaren aslında bizimle birlikte olan bir olgu. İster geniş dünya tarihini, ister Türkiye tarihini düşünelim. Her dönemde farklı şekillerde göç dalgaları olduğunu zaten biliyoruz. Peki şu anda neden göç konusu bu kadar dünyanın gündeminde, bu kadar gazete manşetlerinde, aynı zamanda akademiyada bu kadar büyük bir ilgi var? Bunun aslında temel nedeni biliyoruz. 2011'de Suriye'deki iç savaşın başlaması ve Suriye'den öncelikle komşu ülkelere, daha sonra Avrupa'ya doğru oluşan bu göç dalgası. Bu göç akını hem göçle ilgili politikaları hem de kamuoyunun görüşlerini ciddi anlamda etkiledi ve de bu Suriye'deki iç savaşla birlikte göç konusu kralcılar tarafından ciddi oranda güvenlikleştirilmeye aslında başlandı. Bu göç konusu gerçekten böyle duyguların yoğun olduğu bir tartışma konusu aynı zamanda. Biraz böyle hani futbol takımı tutmak gibi, yani ya işte göç konusuna tamamen negatif yaklaşanlar ya da göç konusuna tamamen pozitif yaklaşanlar. Ama buna böyle bilimsel olarak veriler ışığında yaklaşma meselesi çok fazla kişinin başarabildiği bir şey değil. Bence Hein de Haas'ın kitabının burada en büyük katkısı, yani verilere odaklanarak ama sadece son bir yılın verilerine değil, daha geniş zamanlı verilere odaklanarak bu kafamızdaki mitleri sorgulamamızı sağlaması ve gerçekten de bilimsel yanıtlar vermeye çalışması. Kendisi de bahsetti. Yani en yaygın mitlerden bir tanesi Türkiye dahil işte göç tarihin en yüksek seviyesine çıktı ve işte artık sınırları kontrol edemiyor devletler, böyle bir mitle karşı karşıyayız. Başka bir mit, işte gelişmiş ülkelerde toplumlar giderek yaşlanıyorlar ve göçmenlere ihtiyacımız giderek daha fazla artıyor. Kimine göre göçün baş nedeni fakirlik ve toplumlar kalkındıkça göç oranları azalacak. Ama kimine göre ise göçlere yol açan temel olgu iklim değişikliği. Aslında bu fikirlerin çoğunun pek de doğru olmadığını verilere dayanarak Hein de Haas'ın kitabında görmemiz mümkün. Yine sunumunda kendisinin de belirttiği gibi kitapta burada benim de kısaca özetlediğim, kendisinde 4 tanesini açıkladığı gibi 22 tane farklı mit bulunuyor. Göç oranları gerçekten de artıyor mu? Göçmenler yerel işçilerin işlerini ellerinden alıyorlar mı? Sınırları kapatmak bir çözüm mü? Sınırları kapatmaya çalıştığınız zaman göç akınlarını azaltabiliyor musunuz? Bütün bunların hepsine bilimsel veriler ışığında yanıtlar veriyor. Yani kitabın aslında temel argümanı göçe bizim objektif bir şekilde yaklaşmamızın gerekliliği, bilimsel verilere dayanarak bu veriler ışığında göçü değerlendirmenin ne kadar önemli olduğunu ve aslında ancak bu sayede göçle ilgili tırnak içerisinde gerçeklere ulaşabileceğimizi bize net bir şekilde gösteriyor. Ama göçe ideolojik yaklaştığımızda ya da duygularla yaklaştığımızda gerçek resmi göremeyebiliyoruz. Yazar her bir bölümde göçle ilgili yaygın bir miti anlatıyor önce. Bu mitin özelliklerini anlatıyor. Ama daha sonra bilimsel veriler ışığında bu miti sorguluyor ve aslında bir anlamda yapı söküme de uğratıyor. Kendisi örnekler verdi. Ben burada daha fazla örnek vermek istemiyorum. Bir an önce soru cevap bölümüne belki başlayabiliriz. Sadece ilave edebilirim. Kitapta benim en çok dikkatimi çeken yeni öğrendiğim kavramlardan bir tanesi üçlü açmaz kavramı oldu. Trilema diyor kendisi buna. Yani dailema, hani ikilem, trilema üçlü bir açmaz olarak bunu düşünebiliriz. Türkçe'ye bu şekilde çevirebiliriz. Profesör de Haas'a göre liberal demokratik ülkeler üçlü bir açmaz yaşıyorlar. Bir yandan göçü kontrol etmek için daha fazla önlem almaları gerektiğini düşünüyorlar. Ama bir yandan ekonomik çıkarlar için daha fazla göçmene ihtiyaçları var. Ama bir yandan da uluslararası hukuk var. Yani uluslararası hukukta da mültecilerin ve göçmenlerin bazı hakları var ve devletler de bu anlamda bazı yükümlülüklere sahipler. Dolayısıyla bir yandan böyle ekonomik çıkarlar, bir yandan iç siyaset ve göçü kontrol etme gayreti ya da en azından öyle bir görüntü verme çabası, ama bir yandan da uluslararası hukuk, yani bu üçlü bir açmaz oluşturuyor De Haas'ın yaklaşımına göre ve bu üçlü açmazı çözebilmek için de politikacılar kısa vadeli daha çıkarcı yöntemlere başvurabiliyorlar. Bir yandan yasal göçmenlerin girişini kolaylaştırırken ama uygulamada baktığımızda söylemlerin aksine yasa dışı göçü aslında görmezden geliyorlar. Her ne kadar böyle sınırları daha fazla koruduklarını ifade etseler de rakamlara baktığımızda yasa dışı olan göç de pek çok ülkede farklı farklı şekillerde hala devam ediyor. Ama şu kesin, pek çok ülkede göç konusu hala iç siyasetin önemli gündem maddelerinden bir tanesi ve iç siyasette de siyasetçiler bunu bir anlamda enstrüman olarak kullanabiliyorlar. Özetle şunu söyleyebilirim. Hein de Haas'ın kitabı gerçekten de göçle uzaktan yakından ilgilenen herkes için bence önemli bir referans kaynağı. Göçe taraftar olmak ya da göçe karşı çıkmanın ötesinde göç olgusunu uzun vadeli ve bütüncül bir yaklaşımla irdeliyor. Göç çalışan, göç konusuna ilgi duyan tüm öğrencilerimize ve meslektaşlarımıza Göç ile ilgili Mitler ve Gerçekler kitabını ben de canı gönülden öneririm. Göçle ilgili görüşlerimizi sorgulamamız ve yeniden düşünmemiz için önemli bir rehber olma niteliği taşıyor. Buradan hemen şimdi sizlerin soruları ya da yorumları varsa memnuniyetle onlara geçebiliriz ve isterseniz bir 10-15 dakika kendi aramızda bu konuyu da tartışabiliriz. Buyurun değerli katılımcılar, söz sizin. Ali Zafer Hocam, buyurunuz.
Evet, sesim açıldı galiba. Teşekkür ederim. Aslında misafirlerimizden parmak görmediğim için ben cesaret alarak parmak kaldırdım. Diğer katılımcılar konuşmak isterse çok uzatmak istemem. Doğrusu Hein de Haas bu göç konusunun çok önemli uzmanlarından birisi. Uzun yıllardır bu konuyu çalışan, Kuzey Afrika ve Türkiye üzerine de yani ampirik çalışmalar olan, bu çok daha değerli bence. Çok önemli bir isim. Ben kendisini kalkınma üzerine göçün etkisiyle ilgili yayınlarıyla tanımıştım. Sonra dramatik biçimde Göçler Çağı kitabını baştan tekrar ele almasıyla daha da kendisine olan ilgim arttı ve en son bu kitap benim için doğrusu çok daha dönüm noktası oldu. Bu kitabın özelliği diğerlerinden açıkçası kendisinde ifade ettiği gibi hocam sadece araştırmacılara ya da akademiye hitap etmesi değil. Yani çok siz de herhalde katılırsınız. Sıradan bir şeyle rahatlıkla okunabilecek ve zihnini insanın yormadan bu konularla ilgili e, gerçek bir yere çekecek bir kitap. Doğrusu ben pek çok yerde cesurca da buldum profesörün argümanlarını. Bu muhtemelen benim bulunduğum konumla alakalı. Yani benim Türkiye'de bulunmam ve Türkiye göçü üzerine uzmanlaşmam, e, kendisinin yani sorumda da biraz ona değinmeye çalıştım. Kitabındaki bazı argümanların bende e, karşılık bulmamasına da neden oldu. Aslında sorunda da hani bildiğimiz ön yargılara karşı da bir ön yargı yıkıcı şeyle yaklaşıyor dememin sebebi oydu. Mesela yaşlılıkla ilgili şeyi çok ilginç geldi bana. Yani yaşlılığı azaltacağına dair bir umudun göçle ilgili aslında çok da temelli olmadığı, kanıta dayanmadığını söylemesi mesela çok ilginç. Çünkü Türkiye'de artık son zamanda biliyorsunuz hızlı bir şekilde e, doğum yani doğurganlık kabiliyetini yitiriyor ve bunu kompanse edecek, telafi edecek tek faktör göçe dönmeye başladı. Bu açıdan tekrar yani ben bu doğurganlığa alternatif göç meselesi olur diye düşünüyordum fakat Haas'ın bu şeyi yani argümanı bunu da benim sorgulamama neden oldu. Kısaca şunu da demek istiyorum. Kitap gerçekten akademisyen yani göç uzmanlarına da meydan okuyan bir kitap. Sadece göçe karşıt olanlara değil, göçü şeyle nasıl diyelim e, çok büyük olumlamalarla savunma refleksi gösteren zaman zaman benim de mesela e, e, araştırmacıların da tekrar düşünmelerine neden oluyor. Fakat yine de bu kitabın verdiği ilhamla Türkiye'deki göç meselesini, insan hareketliklerini bize has bir takım şeylerle, bize özgü bir takım özelliklerle tekrar düşünmemiz gerektiğine inanıyorum. Çünkü bu metodolojik milliyetçilik e, yani açık ya da kasıtsız biçimde ortaya çıkan akademideki yani genellikle refah toplumlarının gözünden biraz daha bu şeyleri değerlendiriyor, bu meseleleri. Bizim gibi gelişmekte olan ülkeler için bunları aldığımız ilhamla tekrar değerlendirmemiz gerektiğini düşünüyorum. Çünkü Türkiye'yi şöyle düşünelim. Yani bundan 25 yıl önce gerçekten Türkiye'de yabancı görmek çok nadir şeylerdendi. Özellikle Anadolu'da. Bu 2000'lerden sonra işte Türk iş gücü piyasasının Hein de Haas'ın da çok ustalıkla altını çizdiği şekilde Türkiye'deki sosyal bir transformasyonla yani bunu gerçekten herkes farkında değil. Ben bunu duyduğuma çok memnun oldum. Türkiye'de bir toplumsal dönüşüm, değişimin sonucu olarak zaten bir göç alma şeyi başladı. Bir tarafı turizmle ilgili bunun, bir tarafı işte uluslararası öğrencilerle ilgili, bir tarafı sağlık turizmiyle ilgili vesaire bir sürü faktörün yanında tam da 2011 yılından itibaren bir de hem Türkiye'nin Cumhuriyet tarihinin en büyük göç akınını hem de dünyanın en büyük göç hareketliliğini yani mülteci hareketliliğini biz güney sınırlarımızda karşıladık. Bu göz ardı edilemeyecek büyüklükte bir şey. Yani 3,5-4 milyon civarında bir mültecinin birkaç sene içerisinde Türkiye'ye yığıldığını görüyoruz. Açıkçası bunun siyasallaşması ve politikadaki etkileri bence Avrupa'dan çok daha yavaş oldu Türkiye'de. Yani bir farkımız da belki bununla ilgili söylenebilir. Fakat aynı zamanda Türkiye bu sayede tam bir mülteci çalışmalarını laboratuvarı haline de geldi. İşte Türkiye'deki Göç Araştırmaları Vakfı da buna dahil olmak üzere pek çok araştırmacı hala bu meseleler üzerine kafa yoruyor. Şimdi Suriyelilerle ilgili geri dönüş şeyi başladı ama biz tıpkı Almanya'nın 73'ten sonra Türkleri göndermeye çalışması veya göçü durdurması gibi aslında daha bu meseleyi belki yeni bir fazını Türkiye'de konuşmaya başlayacağız. Yani belki bir mekik göçü konuşacağız. Dönüşlerin tekrar geri dönüşlerini konuşacağız. 1 milyona yakın Suriyeli çocuk var Türkiye'de doğmuş olan. Bunların durumunu konuşacağız mesela. Dolayısıyla ben hala yani bu kitabın yani değerini takdir etmek bile bize şey gelir ama bundan aldığımız ilhamla yani bu kitabın bizim önümüze koyduğu argümanları Türkiye özelinde, Türkiye örneğinde yeniden düşünmemize ilham vermesi gerektiğine inanıyorum. Bu açıdan size Sayın Hocam Türkçeye kazandırılmasında bu kitabın ve aynı zamanda GAV Perspektif Yayınları Yönetim Kurulu'nun Göç Araştırmaları Vakfı'nın yönetim kuruluna da teşekkürlerimi, takdirlerimi iletmek isterim en son olarak. Teşekkür ederim.
Çok teşekkürler Ali Zafer Hocam. Belki Profesör de Haas'ın kitabı bize hani spesifik olarak bu bağlamda da Türkiye'ye çalışmak için ilham verebilir. Yani Türkiye'de de bizim göçle ilgili, mültecilerle ilgili sahip olduğumuz bir takım yaygın düşünceler, yani kamuoyunun düşünceleri, siyasetçilerin argümanları ama acaba bunların ne kadarı doğru? Yani bu mitlerin bazıları belki kitaptaki mitlere benziyor ama belki bir takım farklı şeyler de olabilir. Dolayısıyla hocam yani kitap genel bir çerçeve sağlıyor ama belki yerel bazda da bu tip çalışmalar yapılabilir. Sizin de belirttiğiniz gibi Türkiye yani bunun yapılabileceği herhalde en iyi ülkelerden bir tanesi bu bağlamda da. Çok teşekkürler hocam yorumlarınız ve katkılarınız için. Başka söz almak isteyen katılımcımız var mıdır acaba? Chat'ten de isterseniz yazabilirsiniz. Orayı da mümkün olduğunca takip etmeye çalışıyorum. Evet, arkadaşlarım bu arada kitapları paylaşıyorlar. Ve yine ben sunumumda da bahsettiğim gibi aynı zamanda GAV Perspektif Yayın Göçler Çağı kitabının da Türkçesini yayınladı. 3 yazarlı bir kitap. İlk yazar Profesör de Haas yine bu göçle ilgili en önemli referans kitaplardan bir tanesi. Onu da sizlere hatırlatmış olayım. Mehmet Bey buyurunuz.
Merhabalar hocam. Profesörümüze Hein de Haas hocamıza İngilizce soru yöneltebilir miyim izninizle?
Biz artık Türkçe'ye geçtik.
Türkçe mi yapıyoruz? Tamam.
O yüzden Türkçe sorarsanız
Tamam.
biz kendi aramızda tartışırız. Buyurun.
Hocamıza yöneltemiyoruz yani soru.
Yok artık yani o kısmı tamamladık çünkü
tamam.
ikinci bölüme geçtik. Kendi aramızda konuşuyoruz. Dilerseniz sorunuzu sorun. Bizler yanıtlamaya çalışalım.
Tamam. Ya ben sadece kitapta özellikle çok kısa bir bölümde sadece bir kere geçen bir şey var. Medeniyetler çatışması dediğimiz kültür çatışması tezi üzerine. Buradaki tez üzerine bir kısım geçiyor. Orada çok üzerine hani açıklama yapılmamış. Bunun mit açısından daha fazla derinleştirilebilir mi onu soracaktım. Hani bu mitler açısından hani bu dediğimiz gibi özellikle Müslüman göçünün Avrupa'ya ve Batı dünyasına olan göçüyle beraber ben özellikle Danimarka özelinde saha çalışması yapma fırsatı buldum. Oradaki söylemler üzerine de araştırma yaptığımda ve onların etkilerini gördüğümde bu kültür çatışması tezinin izlerini çok fazla gördüm. Özellikle söylemler üzerinde. Hani bunun mit açısından nasıl bakabiliriz? Hani tam kitapta biraz kısaca değinilmiş. Hani bunu nasıl açabiliriz, buna nasıl bakabiliriz diye bir onu soracaktım aslında.
Anladım. Kendisi mutlaka not etmiştir onu.
Evet,
Çünkü
tamam.
tercümeyi takip ediyor. Çok
Tamam.
teşekkürler yorumunuz için. Başka var mıdır söz almak isteyen, yorum yapmak isteyen? Sanırım yok. Saat de ilerledi. 1,5 saate yaklaşıyoruz. Tam vaktinde başlamıştık. Katılımınız için, sorularınız, yorumlarınız, geri bildirimleriniz için gerçekten çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Çok güzel bir etkinlik oldu ve yeni etkinliklerimizde sizlerle görüşmeyi umut ediyoruz. Yayınlarımızla ilgili sorularınız olursa her zaman memnuniyetle adreslerimizden bizlere ulaşabilirsiniz. And last but not the least, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to Professor de Haas as well. It was wonderful to have you with us this evening and to have this book launch with you. And we will follow your works, and we hope that maybe in the future we will have again some joint seminars with you. Thank you so much for your time.
The pleasure was all mine. Thanks a lot for attending.
İyi akşamlar herkese. Görüşmek üzere. Hoşça kalın.